Howdy boys, and welcome to Mr. East's Classroom. Today we're going to be talking about the settlement and foundation of some of the key American colonies. Now, as we all know, there were 13 American colonies, and when you consider that fact, you have to ask yourself, well, where should we start? Well, we're going to consider two colonies in particular, alright? We're going to keep it to the two that most people go to whenever they consider the early American colonies, and by focusing in on those two, we'll be able to get a good idea about how the colonies were generally started, why they were started, and what kind of foundational character that gave to America. In general, we can consider this view of the founding of the early American colonies as our second start to the class. I know we began with Columbus and the early European exploration, but now we're really getting into the American material, which is why we're going to call this our second start. Our second start will begin with the foundation of the first English colonies, the first permanent English colonies in America that were maintained and that came to exist as states. The two colonies we're going to be covering are those in Virginia and those set up in Massachusetts. These make great picks for a couple of reasons. One, the reasons they were founded, how they were founded, and the societies they built were pretty much as different as you can get within the context of the 13 colonies. Second, they were the first to be settled, so they come as a natural start. On the left here, we see a map roughly of New England, the colonies that were in New England, and the extent of their land claims that they had. I don't need you to pay attention to all those lines and stuff. I just generally want you to see where Massachusetts is on the American coastline. If you'll turn your attention over to the right, this is generally a map of the land and settlements around the Chesapeake Bay, which we looked at in class the other day. Virginia won't come to be known as the colony of Virginia for some time, or rather this whole area in some ways was thought of as Virginia. But we'll get into those details a little bit later on. Right now with these maps, I just want you to be paying attention roughly to where we're talking about. Massachusetts is going to be located in the north, which if you know much about American geography, you'll already know. And Virginia, while not very southern from our Louisiana perspective, as far as the early colonies goes, is considered a southern colony. So let's turn our attention to the Chesapeake. Here's a little picture of a map. Actually, we can see part of the North Carolina coastline, which we've already looked at when we talked about the failed Roanoke colony. And if you turn your attention up to the north of this map, you'll see in yellow the bottom southern end of the Chesapeake and little rivers that go off into what will be known as Virginia. And that's about where we'll be focusing our attention with the colony of Jamestown, which we'll mention in a bit. Before we even look at the details of the Virginia colony, however, I want to point out something that you might have had mistaken before. It's a common mistake. So whenever we look at the early settlement of America, students and people in the American public generally will often confuse two events. You may think that the Pilgrim's Landing, the event with the Mayflower and Thanksgiving, is the same event or the same set of events that leads to the settlement at Jamestown, where you have figures like John Smith and the events covered in the movie Pocahontas. While both sets of events are important to the American founding, they're set in radically different places at slightly different times and with vastly different sets of characters. We're going to be looking at those events in the plan that will come to be known as Virginia because those events happened first. And those would be the events that involve John Smith and that you may have become familiar with the story of Pocahontas. Englishmen like Sir Walter Raleigh first started looking at the area then known as Virginia, but which includes today areas like North Carolina and Virginia proper, the land up and around and near Chesapeake Bay as a potential settlement site, basically because it wasn't claimed or occupied by the Spanish. They thought it would make a suitable location for new colonies, and they thought that the climate would be warm enough to actually live and thrive and have agriculture and all those sorts of things. Now, as we saw with the events at the Roanoke colony, whenever Englishmen got involved in these colonial ventures, they often didn't really know what they were getting into. The same can be said of Jamestown. In fact, a lot of the people who set up the Roanoke colony were involved in setting up the Jamestown colony. The common figure in the organization of both was Sir Walter Raleigh. He was an important Englishman who was close to Queen Elizabeth. He never went to either of the colonies himself, but he was important in organizing the funds for both. The venture that would launch the Jamestown plan was what's known as a joint stock company, which is a term you may have heard before, but effectively that's where very large, or comparatively large, individual stockholders combine their funds into one common fund, found a company, and launch out on a venture in order to make more money. So basically there would be a company organization at home in England who would send out a venture, usually volunteers, often paid company men, or people who were just promised land in return for service, who would ship out overseas to settle a colony in hopes of finding wealth that would basically enable the company to make money. The English government or crown, the royal government, had some interest in the success of these colonies, or would give sanction to them, and were promised that England's power would be expanded overseas by their establishment, but a big part of the motivation was the potential to earn some cash. Now, as you can see, the failure of the Roanoke venture in 1585 kind of warded off other adventurers and would-be entrepreneurs from establishing another colony for quite some time. Jamestown, as many of us probably know or have heard, was established in 1607 on the banks of the River James, which passes through southern Virginia. Now, we'll go into some of the details of the actual physical Jamestown settlement and what those settlers went through early on. But right now, I'm just going to tell you the broad strokes so you understand why they were there and what was going on for them. So this bottom picture here is a drawing of the Jamestown settlement after it had kind of gotten off its feet and was doing all right. The people who first showed up were all company men. It was a company venture. Everyone worked for the joint stock company, I think it was the Virginia company, in charge of the venture. And so everyone was under one unified company rule. Basically, they were organized like a bunch of soldiers, but in service of a private company. As we discussed, whenever they set up the Jamestown colonial venture, people thought there was a good chance that there would be gold in the local area. So the kinds of people who went on the first trip, I think about 100 people came in the first shipment of people, although they were consistently reinforced with new rounds of volunteers. I think in about the first year, maybe the first couple of years, about 500 people total arrived. In class, we'll talk about some of the gruesome details of what happened to those people. But they were all, or many of them early on, were goldsmiths or specialty craftsmen. People who were not really prepared to tough it out in the swamps and do the kind of hardcore agricultural work that they were actually going to have to do. In short, the people who got there were not totally prepared for what they were going to encounter. They weren't really sure what the landscape was going to be, and it was a very, very hard couple of years for them to get a plan straight. Which turns us to the concept of making the land pay. The people in the Virginia colony, in the Jamestown colony, were there for the purpose of making a living and making money. That was the reason the joint stock company was established. That's the reason everyone was shipped there. And for anyone who volunteered, that was their primary motivation too. If you were a poor person in England, you wanted to go off on this venture to make some money. The people coming were overwhelmingly single men. Eventually women would be shipped in. But early on, it's mostly men just hanging out there in the wilderness trying to figure out what to do. At first, the English settlers really didn't know how to survive or what to do. They were running low on provisions. They weren't sure what to grow. But the local Native Americans kind of helped them out. And the colonists who were there were sort of organized, or at least the very few who survived, were organized under the tight leadership of a man named John Smith, who you have probably heard of, a guy who we'll talk more about in class. His story is pretty cool. Under John Smith's leadership, the colonists, or at least a small remaining portion of them, were able to survive the first year. And in that time, gradually, they came to find a way to make money and make the company turn a profit. That route lay in the crop of tobacco, which was first learned to be grown and harvested productively by a man named John Rolfe. John Rolfe kind of made it big with the discovery of tobacco, and he's the actual guy who married the real person, Pocahontas, who was the daughter of one of the Powhatan Indian chiefs. This is a drawing or an artist's interpretation of what life would have looked like in the Jamestown or Virginia colony early on. It's kind of a fanciful representation, as you can tell, because people working in the fields most likely didn't have plumed hats on while they did so. But the general observation that they're working with a crop of tobacco is accurate, and that tells us a little bit about how things were organized in Jamestown. Namely, that the economy was overwhelmingly agricultural, and that the settlement pattern on account of that was pretty spread out. People lived in spread out farmsteads. Over the years, as the colony grew and people spread out throughout the area of coastal Virginia, that became a big draw for people to come, was the wide availability of land and the potential to make money growing tobacco. New settlers were drawn under something known as the Headright System, effectively where people were promised large tracts of land, both by volunteering to come to Virginia and also by rounding up people who could come to Virginia. So the idea being, if you came and you farmed and worked for the company for a while, you would be given land. And likewise, if you could gather up enough people to come work, you would also be given a large amount of land. Because the company initially ran things so poorly in Virginia, leadership or dominion of the colony was eventually transferred over to the crown, King James at the time, who would then be the more formal head instead of the company organization. And Virginia became a royal colony, and that was their new sort of system of government. Over time, moving towards the 1640s, Virginia became a relatively prosperous and stable place to live after the early really hard and dangerous years. A number of the descendants of the people who initially settled and descendants of the people who became very large and successful tobacco planters kind of emerged as a sort of new aristocracy and leadership class in Virginia. So the social picture that we see at after a couple of decades is that you have an agricultural society spread out over a relatively large area, kind of governed and ruled over by an aristocracy of landed farming elites. Not everyone was so well off in the Virginia colony, however. Many of the people who were lured under the Headright System, these were white Englishmen, were indentured servants, which meant that they were, for all intents and purposes, sort of slaves for a given amount of years, usually something like 10, and then the idea was that after 10 years they'd be free and they'd be given a plot of land of their own. Very often they were not given any land, but they would earn freedom. Sometimes they could be trapped in servitude because of a sort of debt cycle where they could end up being slaves for quite a long time. The Virginians, of course, were the first English Americans to import African slaves as well, who they got from Dutch traders in 1619. And that was a practice that grew up. It was never too big in the mid-1600s when Jamestown's first getting started. But over time, slavery as an institution is going to grow up very rapidly, and that's something we'll talk about in full later. Slavery was attractive to many of the Virginia farmers because it provided a very cheap labor source by which they could harvest large amounts of tobacco. They wouldn't have to pay anyone, and also it prevented there from being a large underclass of free white settlers, something that's an arrangement that gets kicked off by Bacon's Rebellion, which was basically an event where a bunch of landless poor whites got angry at the wealthy farming aristocracy and attempted to revolt against them. So that sort of fear of an underclass and a desire for for high agricultural profits is going to eventually move Virginia and the other southern colonies that pop up in the direction of slavery. Again, that's a topic we're going to dive into in class. So what are the key areas to note, the things we need to take away from the Virginia settlement and what it tells us about the development of the American colonies as a whole? The Virginia colony was spread out. It was made up of farms that were spread out over the countryside, and usually these farms were pretty large because you needed a lot of space to have a profitable agricultural product. The early settlers were overwhelmingly single men looking to make money. Very many of them failed, many of them died, but the ones who did survive and did succeed were kind of whittled down into a very hardened kind of person. And those people, for good or for bad, managed to make Virginia a very prosperous and, at least from a financial perspective, successful colony. The purpose of the colony all along, from the early days of Jamestown under company rule, were towards profit. Making money was the goal, and the promise of the potential to have a sort of more prosperous, brighter future was a big draw for a lot of the early settlers, most of whom came from the English lower classes who were being driven off their own land over in England. In Virginia, we have the growth of a quasi-pseudo-democratic government, which started under company rule as a way to sort of placate many of the settlers. They had what was called the House of Burgesses, which you've probably heard of, which was not a formal legislature, rather it was a place where the male heads of household in Virginia could elect things that were called burgesses, basically representatives, who would go to the House of Burgesses, and rather than having formal legislative power, they could make recommendations both to the company, and whenever the company was replaced by royal government, they could make recommendations to the king and his officials. This is important because it starts the idea early in America that the people governed should have some say in what government does. Even though the House of Burgesses didn't have a whole lot of formal powers, the people of Virginia were pretty proud of it and were protective of the privilege. And because many of them owned land, something that not everyone in England could do, they began to see themselves in kind of a sort of, well, they were very proud of themselves and what they'd accomplished. And because there were slaves and indentured servants around, many of the sort of free Virginians came to see themselves as wealthy, powerful, and free men. And that was sort of an important identity that they had built up. And of course, the economy was overwhelmingly agricultural, at first centered on tobacco. Later on, other crops will come, but for now, that's what we're looking at. Hi everyone, it's Mr. East here. I'm cutting this in post-production, kind of like an intermission. I've decided to end the video for today here, at the end of the Virginia information. The video on all the colonies kind of spiraled on longer than I wanted it to, and I don't want to dump that much information on you all on one video, especially on a Friday and then on a Monday. I thought that'd be very rude. So I'm going to stop the video here. Please remember to do the accountability assignment, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.